10 a.m. Let's get started. Thank you for joining us today for our town hall regarding Section 106 and some of the changes that we're undergoing with you at the State Historic Preservation Office. So we're very excited to have you today. I understand there are over 125 people who have registered. I hope that we are able to have you all on the video line today. My name is Martha McFarlane Fays. I'm the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer for the state of Michigan. And I'm very pleased to be with you today and to explain what we're trying to do here with the SHPO. We are going to be discussing some of the changes that our SHPO team is rolling out this year in an effort to better align our processes with federal regulations and to create a more efficient review process for applications. During today's webinar, we will review the details of Section 106, its origins, what it does, and how it works, who is responsible for each step along the way. So before we get started and I introduce our speakers today, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping matters with you. Let me just check my notes here. So everybody on the line right now is muted to reduce any background noise. And we want to engage your questions during the presentation. So if you have a question or you have a point you'd like to make, please utilize the Q&A option on your Zoom browser to ask questions, and we'll be going back through them to ensure that all the questions are answered during the presentation. If you have a particularly challenging question, please do your best to write it down, but we ask for clarification and unmute your microphone to allow for discussion. We appreciate your participation and look forward to this coming discussion. We expect this will last, I think we've scheduled about an hour for the presentation, or 45 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A for the following time, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can during the presentation. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the other speakers who you see here, and if you could unmute your phones just to say hello. First, I'd like to introduce Katie Kolokithis. She is our survey coordinator at the State Historic Preservation Office, and she's been instrumental in helping to set up this town hall. Second person, Brian Grinnell. He is our environmental review coordinator, and he is the one who basically sees all of your applications as they come in for Section 106. And he's working out of the office today, so you get a little view of our SHPO office. We've relocated to a new location at 300 North Washington Square. That's the MEDC building. We are now using, you can see behind me, the Pure Michigan logo. So that is our new location since last August. Stacy Trzynski, our archaeologist, she is with us today, and she will be addressing specifically a lot of the archaeological concerns. She reviews all of our projects for archaeological impacts. Rob McKay is also on the line from our staff. He's our architect, and he's going to be available at the end of the session to answer any questions that you might have. I do want to start also with a bit of an apology. We did attempt to do this town hall back in June. Unfortunately, we encountered some technical issues and we found a better way to do this presentation for you. So we're starting over, and I'm glad you can join us. For those who are missing it, this is being recorded, so it can be shared in the future with others who need to have this information who could not join us today. So with that, I think we will launch right into it. I do want to say a couple of other notes that are going to be repeated throughout the presentation today. This session that we're having today is only going to be applying to federally assisted projects, federally funded or licensed projects. It is not going to address procedures with regard to state level reviews that the SHPO conducts. So if you do have questions about that, we are happy to consider them, but I think we're going to have to deal with full processes another time. This is just for the federal reviews. Also, some of you might be relieved to hear this, I hope, but this is not going to impact right now our use of HUD CDBG rehabilitation cards for single family rehab properties. That process is not changing at this time. So once you get through the end, if you have more questions about that, and again, some of these points will be repeated today, we would be happy to entertain those questions. So let's go ahead and get started. I believe, Brian, you are going to go first and tell us about why we're doing this, what the legal background is for all of this. Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Martha. Hi, everyone. Brian Grinnell. I'm Cultural Resource Management Specialist at the SHPO. Work pretty much with Section 106 all the time. So, and I'm going to start out today with the regulations, the Section 106 regulations, to kind of give a background on what Section 106 actually is and why it exists. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which was passed in 1966, in response to the loss or alteration of many historic properties as a result of federal programs. So most notably interstate highway, urban renewals programs like that. At that time, there was a lot of public concern that historic resources weren't receiving adequate attention for these kind of projects. One example, if you look at the photo there on the slide at the far right, that's the residence of Ransom E. Olds here in Lansing, Michigan. As you may know, Ransom Olds was the founder of Oldsmobile and later of Rio Motors. That was his residence, which was torn down in the 1960s to make way for I-496 through the middle of Lansing. And I-496 was ironically later named Olds Freeway. So this is just like one example of the type of concern that was being raised for these types of projects and why the National Historic Preservation Act was enacted. Congress recognized the concerns, enacted the legislation to protect historic properties that were being harmed by federal activities. It's the nation's first environmental law. It actually predates NEPA by a few years, and it's the most comprehensive historic preservation law in the United States. Next slide. So Section 106 requires all federal agencies to consider the effects of their actions on historic properties. The responsible federal agency must consult with the State Historic Preservation Office, as well as other state and local officials, Indian tribes, and the public to consider their concerns about historic preservation issues. So it's a consultation rather than a review or an approval. The SHPO only comments on how federal actions may impact historic resources. We don't provide approval or clearance on projects or on particular sites. In many ways, Section 106 should be considered a planning tool, and it should be engaged early in the process so that it may prevent you from making decisions that could affect historic resources, which may be difficult to reverse later on. Next slide. So who does what under Section 106? Well, under Section 106, the federal agency behind an undertaking requiring consultation holds all of the responsibility for carrying out Section 106. Under Section 106, the agency must first determine if there's an undertaking, and if so, identify the area of potential effects. So the definition of undertaking in the regulations is it's basically any activity, so whether it be funding, licensing, permitting, or anything like that, any action by a federal agency that just by its nature, the nature of the actual project, might have the potential to impact historic resources, regardless of whether or not you already know there's something historic there. It's just by the nature of what's taking place. The next step then, after identifying the undertaking and identifying the area that's going to be impacted, is then to go out and identify historic properties in that area. The third step would be then to assess the effects that might occur to those properties. And then finally, resolve any potential adverse effects through avoidance, minimization, or mitigation. The federal agency must follow these steps to document how their project or action may affect historic properties and present their finding to the SHPO. Next slide. So consultation technically is between the federal agency and the SHPO. That's the way the regs are written. But in reality, the federal agency often delegates or passes the task of carrying it out, but doesn't really always explain or give good guidance on what that means. So for example, Federal Highway Administration passes funding typically down for road projects through the Michigan Department of Transportation, not to pick out any particular agency, but this is just an example. MDOT may then pass consultation on to applicants to get that funding. Applicants then may hire a consultant to carry out their Section 106 as well as other maybe other environmental concerns, things like that. The more that responsibility gets passed down, the less clear the expectations and the requirements become. So unfortunately, sometimes even we receive applications where the submitting party doesn't even know who the federal agency is. So that makes it difficult for us to know who we're actually dealing with. 90% of the projects we get probably come from applicants and consultants rather than agencies. But even in those cases, it's important to remember that they're still responsible for providing adequate documentation on how or if federal actions will impact historic resources in such a way that we can look at that documentation and say, yes, we agree or we disagree with you. So one of the changes we're now implementing regarding delegation is that if agencies are delegating these types of this consultation down, we will be requiring a formal letter of delegation from the federal agency to show that they're still in the game in this and that they're passing on that responsibility. This is a necessary step to work more closely with federal agencies who are ultimately responsible for the consultation. So, next slide. So you may be asking, what does the SHPO do then? Well, under the federal regulations, Section 106, SHPO is a mandatory consulting party in the process to ensure that historic properties are given adequate consideration if they might be affected by federal undertakings. Agencies must consult with us in order to move forward with a project or an action. The SHPO will either concur or disagree with an agency's adequately documented finding of eligibility and effects. So eligibility, so identification of historic properties, and then assessing effects on those historic properties. If there is an adverse effect, the SHPO will continue to consult with the agency to resolve any of the adverse effects through avoidance, minimization, or mitigation. It's important to note that the SHPO is not a regulatory authority. We don't clear projects. We don't dictate outcomes. We can't tell you what you have to do with your project or what you can or can't do. All we can do is comment on, if you do it, this is how it might impact historic resources. The SHPO does not conduct research, nor do we have a complete list or database of every historic property in the state. We maintain files on listed properties, as well as survey and inventory data. And we're happy to make that available for research efforts. However, it's by no means exhaustive. It's not complete. And while we're happy to help you and provide you access to those resources, we rely on you to conduct the research. We can't do the research for you. Next slide. So you're going to be asking, what's changing? Well, we've noted that in many of the applications that we receive, applicants and consultants currently submitting Section 106 are unfamiliar with a lot of the basics of Section 106 consultation. Many of the applications received don't address potential archaeological concerns. They don't make determinations of eligibility. They often cite inadequate, or in some cases may not feature any research or identification efforts, and quite often don't include supporting documentation or a statement supporting any kind of determination of effects. And when these items are not completed prior to submitting to the State Historic Preservation Office, it leads to longer consultation periods, because we have to end up filling in the gaps for those rather than focusing on actually providing comprehensive consultation and concurrence. So therefore, we will require the use of qualified consultants to conduct, at a minimum, the identification of historic resources for all projects. So this includes both above ground and archaeological resources. And as I mentioned earlier, we will require a formal letter of delegation from federal agencies for submitting those projects on their behalf. They will be delegating their authority to begin consultation with the Michigan SHPO. But this does not mean that they will be delegating their responsibility for decisions. Next slide. So the agency still remains responsible. Next slide, please. Okay, so you're probably asking, well, why are we doing this now? We've always done it this way. It's always been this way. Well, that's true. However, we are endeavoring to follow the federal regulations more closely, as many other states have already been doing for years. Our process will be more similar and more consistent with regulations and how Section 106 is carried out elsewhere. We've been working on these plans for well over a year. And although these changes have not specifically been caused by the current pandemic, it certainly highlights a lot of the concerns that we've had, and highlights the need for actually making these changes. We do realize that this make a lot of you feel overwhelmed. A lot of you that have been doing this all along might be overwhelmed about the amount of responsibility and the work that's required to do this. And that's okay, we understand that. At the same time, that just shows really that you're probably not qualified or not able to do that, which is why we're making these requirements to get qualified people. But with this change, we'll be looking to work differently for all of us. The goal is to kind of really to ensure that we'll better align with the federal regulations, and the process will be really, overall, will be more efficient, more comprehensive, more quick, and more impactful in the future. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, well, I'm just going to go over, I've been mentioning the regulations, and I'm just going to go over a couple of citations from the regulations that kind of point out these requirements. So first, in Section 110 of the National Historic Preservation Act, Standard 2B of the notes that Section 2B of the Secretary of Interior Standards and Guidelines for Federal Historic Preservation Program specifies that identification and evaluation of historic properties must be conducted by professionally qualified individuals. The standard references Section 112 of the National Historic Preservation Act, which requires federal agencies to ensure that all actions taken by employees or contractors meet professional standards, and that agency personnel or contractors responsible for historic preservation meet qualification standards. So the federal agency remains legally responsible for the adequacy of the background research, fieldwork reports, and any documentation for findings regarding eligibility and effect, and the proposed resolution of adverse effects set forth in any mitigation documents. Next slide. So the regulations, actually, they specifically mention qualifications in 36 CFR Part 802. Federal agencies, applicants often rely on the services of consultants and contractors to carry out research and inventory and prepare analysis and recommendations to inform federal agencies Section 106 review. Regardless of who carries out studies and prepares the Section 106 documentation, the federal agency is responsible for ensuring that actions taken by employees or contractors meet professional standards under regulations developed by the Secretary of the Interior, and for ensuring that contents of any documents or studies prepared by a non-federal party meet applicable standards and guidelines. And additionally, the 106 regulations also remind federal agencies to consider other applicable professional, state, tribal, and local laws, standards, and guidelines in identifying historic properties in 36 CFR 800.4. So I probably kind of overwhelmed you with the actual regulations. I'm going to turn it back over to Martha, and she's going to kind of go over specifically what the federal qualifications are and what they mean.
Thank you, Brian. So Brian mentioned federal qualifications. So under federal law, 36 CFR Part 61, which Brian mentioned, there are qualifications, professional qualifications, actually, for engaging in professional quality historic preservation work. All of those people on staff at the SHPO and at the federal level meet those qualifications in order to be able to work in this capacity. We have a variety of staff who meet the qualifications of either historic architect or archaeologist or architectural historian. You can see three of those qualifications there for qualifications in history, architectural history, or archaeology. Again, those are outlined in the Secretary of the Interior standards and guidelines. And as I mentioned, they're used across the country. Can we go to the next slide? Okay. I am not going to read through every single qualification standard that's here, but it does outline a list that you see on your screen of what those federal qualifications are for history, archaeology, or architectural history. Those are the basic qualifications that you would need in order to conduct Section 106 review, as we are describing it, in order to have a qualified consultant in one of those areas. Generally speaking, it requires a graduate level degree in one of those respective fields or related field. And also for archaeology, it does require a certain amount of field and work experience that is beyond that graduate level degree. So I encourage you to just familiarize yourself with them. Again, when you're looking for contracting a qualified consultant, they would have that background, and you would be able to know that they meet those standards. We do have a list of people that have been vetted by our office. We don't endorse any particular consultant, but we do have a list of qualified consultants who do meet those qualifications and have demonstrated that they meet those qualifications. Next slide. Katie.
There are three different, I'll just mention this quickly because there are two different qualified consultant lists on our website. There's one for historic architects. That's primarily for use for federal historic tax credit projects. And then there's a second list that contains architectural historians, and archaeologists. And that is the list that you're going to want to look at. It's updated roughly 2 times a year when I can make that happen. I try really hard to keep it updated. But I'm due for an update right now. So hopefully there'll be an updated one in the next couple of weeks that if I can get to it. So, and then that website at the bottom is where the standards are found. So the identification of historic resources, the kinds of things that you're going to be looking for from your qualified staff or your consultant is the first step of all of this is determining your area of potential effect. That is one of the most important things. And I also think one of the things that causes the most confusion. We often get a lot of questions, and people want us to tell them what their APE should be. That is not our responsibility. That is the responsibility of the federal agency or their designee. But you need to make a logical decision about what kinds of impacts your project could have and the area around your project that could have. Not every project is going to be just the footprint of your project. There could be, for example, cell towers have a much larger footprint depending on the height of the tower, or road projects where there is additional, they may just be doing work in the roadway or in the right of way, as many folks will say, but if there's tree removal or other things that potentially could impact structures that are outside of that right of way, then that all needs to be assessed. So really thinking about and then documenting why your area of potential effect is what it is, and then making a logical explanation of that is going to be really important for this. It has to make sense to us based on the scope of work. So then the next step would be to review existing information on historic properties. That is not just limited to what's in our office. Myself and Stacy Trzynski run a research request email address that probably many of you have used in the last year or so that we've been using it. And that is a good way to get preliminary information about a project. As of July 1st, archaeological information is now only available to qualified archaeologists, but the above ground information is technically public record, so that can still be sent to anyone. But the expectation is that the identification and determinations of eligibility for above ground properties will be done by a federally qualified architectural historian. So someone could request that, but it needs to be vetted and looked at by a federally qualified architectural historian. And like I said, reviewing the existing information does not stop. It's not limited to our office. It should also include other repositories like local archives, historic societies, county records, township records, those kinds of things. It should be kind of a comprehensive look of what is known in that area. And then the next step is to seek information from different consulting parties and others. The problem that we've had in the past is that some agencies and consultants would reach out to us for this research, but not everyone. And then there was no new identification done. So the regs say that new identification is supposed to be done, things that we don't know about. There's no way that we can know about every single historic property in the state. Like Brian said, we do maintain surveys and inventories of historic properties, but that is, as many of you know, there are whole townships that we don't have any historic sites are. That doesn't mean there aren't things there. It just means we have not been notified of them yet. So let's see. Then that's one of our problems in the timing of things, is that our staff then has to figure out from what little information got sent in, we had to figure out if there's anything there that's going to be impacted, which takes a significant amount of time and effort on our part, and that's not supposed to be our job. So the new process, we're hoping, helps speed things up a little bit by using federally qualified individuals who can actually do identification of historic properties and identify those new things that we may not know about. Let's see. Oh, and then the other thing that I'll mention too, because I think this is something that often gets left behind, SHPO is one of the mandatory consulting parties, but please don't forget to consult with tribes. There are, Stacy can maybe step in, and I can't remember off the top of my head how many federally recognized, are there 12, am I right? Tribes in Michigan, but they be sure to consult with them on your projects, because that's very, very, very important. And that should not be something that you put onto your consultant. That should be government to government consultation. It should not be something that your consultant has done. Yeah, Brian, did you want to say something else? So the kinds of things that make a property historic, we're not just looking at age when we're looking at things to make a property historic. We're looking at a number of different criteria that are established by the National Park Service as part of the National Register process. We also look at integrity of a property. So we're looking at kind of all of those things combined. Just because something's not 50 years old doesn't mean that it wouldn't meet one of the criteria considerations for if it's exceptionally significant. So don't let that 50-year-old mark fool you, I guess. There's a lot of things in Michigan. We have a very extensive modern architectural history here. And so don't let that 50-year mark be the only thing that you're looking at. But that also doesn't mean everything over 50 years old is historic in our books, I guess. So that's and we can be looking at anything from a building to an object like a fountain, to a historic district, to archaeological sites, to structures like bridges. It runs the whole entire gamut of things. It's a large variety of things. And our list of historic properties is not static. It constantly changes. We get new surveys and information in every day. We do have a fairly large backlog of data that hasn't gotten into our database as well, which is why we recommend a lot of the time pre-COVID era that folks come in and look at survey reports, because a lot of the data has not been extracted from those yet. We are slowly opening back up to appointments as needed for qualified consultants. So when you hire a consultant and they need to get in, we are able to accommodate that now. So, and as more federal projects take place, more sites are identified and evaluated and added to the inventory. So the better data we can get into our system, the better data we can provide out. So it's really a win-win for everyone. The entire state has not been surveyed, and there are things out there that are eligible that we just don't know about yet. So consideration of archaeology is an important part of the 106 process. Any project that involves ground disturbance, it requires identification work to be done by a qualified archaeologist. This is particularly important. Oftentimes we'll get projects where they don't think that there's ground disturbance, or it's all in a previously disturbed area, and those kinds of things are important for us to know, but there are additional assessment factors that need to be done by a qualified archaeologist. They have training that most folks will not, to understand when there's a higher potential for something to be found. So please be sure to follow that guidelines. Ground disturbing projects that don't meet this requirement will be returned unreviewed for resubmission after a qualified archaeologist has participated in the identification. So this is a really important part of this. And like I said, information on previously reported archaeological sites will not be available to non-qualified individuals anymore. So you got your identification done. What next? One of our challenges that we've had in the last few months has been having folks get their identification done by their qualified consultant and then just stapling it on the back of their application. We want there to be a little bit more analysis of that done to be able to make it so that it ties into your determination of effect. So making sure that you aren't just doing that, and maybe that entails having your qualified professional write your determination of effect, or at least give a recommendation of what the determination of effect should be. And Brian, I think, is going to talk some more about determination of effect.
Yep, thanks. So after doing your identification efforts, the next step obviously is to assess potential impacts, potential effects. So to do that, you have to apply the criteria of effects to determine whether the undertaking are going to have one of the following outcomes. The first one would be no historic properties affected. So either no historic properties exist there within the area of potential effects, or they exist but just won't be affected in any way by the project. The second option would be there will be no adverse effects on historic properties. So there are historic properties and there will be effects, but they won't be adverse effects. And then the third one would be an adverse effect on historic properties. So remember that when we're talking about effects can be direct as well as indirect. And always remember in your application to the determination that you make, provide documentation or a statement explaining how you came to that decision. As I indicated earlier, most of the applications we come in, there might be a box checked off with a determination, but no explanation on how you came to that conclusion. And that's really not helping us at all, just checking a box. I mean, we really need to know how you made that decision. So next slide, please. So let's talk about adverse effects for just a second. Adverse effects only account for maybe 1% of all of the projects that we see, but it is the most complicated. Consultation for an adverse effect can take the longest amount of time. Therefore, if you want to keep your project moving swiftly, an adverse effect should be avoided at all if possible, which is why when we indicated the idea of engaging Section 106 early in the process, the idea is so you don't get to this point in the first place. It's to avoid it in the first place. So adverse effects can include the following, and I want you to look real closely at the second and third regarding indirect effects. As Katie mentioned earlier, the idea of right-of-way and things like that. So the first one would be demolition or alteration. Also changes in use or setting. As well as introduction of intrusive or audible or visual elements. So those quite often refer to indirect effects that most people don't think about. They think, well, I'm not going to be touching that building. No, but are you going to be making changes that might impact the character, the setting, visually, visual intrusion, anything like that. Also, neglect is another adverse effect as well, and that typically refers to federal properties, properties in federal ownership. And same thing with transfer of property from federal ownership, because once it's taken out of federal ownership, then it loses its automatic protection under a federal agency. So whoever carries out the research and field work on Section 106, the federal agency remains legally responsible for all findings and determinations, including determinations of effect, and must ensure the sufficiency of the background research, field work, and reports regarding recommendations of eligibility and effect, and proposed resolution of adverse effects. Next slide, please. So what do you do if there is an adverse effect? If so, yeah, the agencies, first of all, as we said, we must seek ways to avoid them. But if they can't be, if all feasible alternatives have been considered, there's no way to avoid the adverse effect, then agencies must mitigate the adverse effects, either minimizing or rectifying the effects, reduce or eliminating them over time, or compensating for them. And this is done in consultation with the State Historic Preservation Office, as well as engaging other interested parties. The Section 106 process then concludes in the execution of a memorandum of agreement, which is a legal document that outlines the terms and conditions by all the parties involved to mitigate the effects, and specifies who's responsible for carrying out any actions to execute it. So, as I said, this can take a lot of time. This doesn't always happen quickly. So the idea is to avoid this in the first place, if possible. Okay, I'm going to turn it back to Katie.
Yep. So how this is going to go. Beginning July 1st, SHPO research will only be available to archaeologists, architectural historians, and historians who meet the federal professional qualifications. Like I did mention, technically the above ground information is available to the public. But our expectation is that identification work is actually going to be done by somebody that's qualified. And then beginning July 1st, any application for 106 consultations submitted by a consultant or other entity that is not the federal agency must include a letter of formal delegation of authority from the agency. Like Brian said, we're really trying to push to make the federal agencies and make it go back to what it's supposed to be, where we're not consulting with the consultants and developers and people that aren't really supposed to be involved. The other thing that's coming and we're hoping will help kind of clarify some of this is that there will be a new application that will be available in the next few weeks, and then it will be required starting January 1st of 2021. So we're hoping that kind of helps lay out our expectations for the identification. We've also done, we did a town hall for federally qualified consultants at the end of June, I think it was, and we'll continue to roll out some additional training for them so that they understand what our expectations are and are not. Our expectations are not that they will be doing a formal survey on every project. That's not what we're trying to do. So we want to make sure that they understand what we're looking for and can help you all navigate this process more quickly. So that's kind of where we are all still working from home for the most part. A few of us are going into the office on kind of scattered days. And like I said, we are able to do like limited research appointments for qualified consultants when they need to, but we are still providing what we can electronically for now to your consultants. So we're doing our best to continue to navigate this crazy time with our our staffing situation and our current work from home situation. So we also do have, I'm trying to look through my notes. We also have an online portal to submit 106 applications to that's available, but we do still prefer hard copies being mailed to the office. As you can see, Brian's in the office a couple days a week now, and they're picking up the mail regularly. So the hard copies are our preference, but if you need to, that portal is available. There are instructions on our website for that. We are recommending that as soon as that new application goes up, to start using that so that you have lots of time to get used to it. And we will be rolling out some educational initiatives for agencies and consultants about those new forms in the fall. And let's see. And we do anticipate that the consultants will there will probably be a little bit of an adjustment period as they figure out what they need to do in terms of level of effort for those new applications. So we do anticipate that there will probably be a little bit of a learning curve on their part, but we're going to do our best to help them get a clear picture of our expectations. So I think that's kind of it. And then
Thank
we
you,
just have
Kate.
questions. Mhm.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks to everybody on our team for being here. I know these are big changes, lots of changes for everybody, and I think it's going to take some time to adapt to this, but our goal and what we have in mind for everybody is that this is going to be more efficient for everybody on both sides of the equation, both for you and for SHPO, and for you to get a timely response from SHPO for project reviews. I neglected to introduce Nathan Niedering, who is a project manager for our SHPO office, and he helps us with a little bit of everything and all of our social media. He's in the background here on our presentation and is helping with the Q&A. So I think we are going to turn it over and see. I see that there are a few questions that have come in, and please, now that we've kind of given you the overview, we'd like to get more questions from you, and we'll do our best to answer them right now. As I say, this is being recorded, and if you have other people who you know would be interested in getting this information, all of this is going to be available. And I think Nathan will have more details as to how that's going to happen. I'm sure it'll be linked to our website too. The link to our website is at the bottom of the screen right in front of you, michigan.gov/SHPO.
Hi, everyone. I'm Nathan Niedering. I've been answering some questions here in the background, and other people have been asking additional questions, which the staff will now have an opportunity to answer. I'm going to be taking these out of order so that they kind of try to flow logically a little bit. So just be patient, and we will try to get to as many as we can. And just to jump back to what Martha was saying, we do have a web page on our website that specifically discusses all these changes. If you have not seen it yet, if you go to michigan.gov/SHPO, right at the top in a red bar, there's a thing that says there are changes coming to Section 106 in Michigan. Click on that, follow where that link takes you, and it will describe a summary of the changes that are coming. This PowerPoint presentation that you're viewing now is already available online on the website. And then this recording will also be uploaded. We're hoping by the end of this week that will be on as well, so you can share that with other colleagues. Okay, so we will dive right into the questions here. From Karsten Applegate, is it required to use multiple consultants with different specializations for each project? Brian or Katie, maybe?
Brian's muted. Do you want to handle it, Brian, or you want me to?
Sorry, I couldn't hear that.
So I can answer it quickly. Sometimes, yes, that will be necessary. It depends on what kinds of impacts your project is going to have. If your project is only going to have impacts that are above ground, like they are rehabbing a historic structure that there is no ground disturbance, there's no construction of a parking lot, there's no changing up of sewer lines or those kinds of things, then it might not be required to use an archaeologist. But if it's a historic building, then you need to use a architectural historian. In our experience, it's fairly rare for those kinds of, they definitely happen, but a lot of projects have some sort of ground disturbance. So yes, the answer is yes, basically. If there are, say you're building a, for example, a pipeline through the middle of nowhere, somewhere in northern Michigan, and there isn't a single historic there's no structures at all in your entire, or landscapes or anything that would be potential above ground, then it might not be required to use an architectural historian, but obviously you would need an archaeologist. So it's going to depend a little bit on what the scope of the project is. I don't know if you want to say anything else, Brian.
All right, thank you, Katie. Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I'll just add one more thing. We do expect that there is going to have to be some capacity building of consulting firms, and they are all aware of that. There are only a handful right now that have both archaeologists and architectural historians. So we do understand and are kind of actively having those conversations with the consulting firms. But we do encourage you, there's a number of smaller 1 or 2 people firms they're all kind of working on partnering up with each other right now. So be sure to, if you want to use that qualified consultants list, feel free to. It's not a requirement. You don't have to use that. It's just a courtesy. There are many other folks that meet the federal qualifications that just haven't expressed interest in being on our list yet. People that are on that list are supposed to be actively seeking work in Michigan. We try really hard to kind of vet them out of there to make sure that they are actively seeking work. If you encounter, the same 3 or 4 people that just aren't interested, let me know, because I can reach out to them and make sure that they are actually interested in seeking work in Michigan, because that's what that list is for. So I think that's about it.
Okay, thank you. This one's probably for Martha. The question from Missy is, have you had support or comments from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation in advancing any of these important changes?
We have not had specific comments to my knowledge directed from the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, but for Michigan, I should say. But I think nationwide, this is a common practice, and it's supported at the federal level by our partners at the Advisory Council. For those of you who aren't familiar with what the Advisory Council is, it's a federal presidentially appointed board that oversees Section 106 activity throughout the country. And oftentimes the Advisory Council is called in to deal with disputes or very complex or high profile cases across the country. So over the years, we have a very strong partnership with them. If you do have an adverse effect project, then that automatically gets kicked up to the Advisory Council, and they're offered the opportunity to comment on that. But we have not had specifically something directed at Michigan, but I think nationwide it's supported, and there are, as we've mentioned, other states throughout the country that have adopted these principles. Michigan has just been slow to do that, but also it is a regulatory responsibility. It's spelled out numerous places, not only in the Section 106 regulations, but also in the obligations that federal agencies undertake with regard to 106 and within their own regulations. So, we do feel that we are catching up to a standard that's been applied pretty consistently elsewhere.
I'll just add too, I spoke with somebody from the Advisory Council that corresponded through email, talking to him about some of our changes and our interpretations of what the regulations say about these requirements. And basically he'd indicated that this is something that they'd been trying to come up with some kind of language for that. They agreed with our interpretations of the regulations as far as the requirements of using qualified people.
That's good to know, Brian. Thank you.
Probably sort of immediately following up on that question from Lindsay Ross. I'd like to know how the federal agencies have responded to these changes and whether they have considered the consultation for Section 106 review for reimbursement in any grant programs. I assume she means the cost associated with Section 106 as reimbursable for a grant program.
I'll try to take that on too, and if other staff want to chime in. In terms of costs, that is something that you'd have to explore with the respective federal agency. My understanding after 23 years of practice in this profession is that these expenses for this kind of work or for your NEPA work are qualified expenses for projects. I can't speak to every single agency in every single situation, but I would really look into that and how basically your environmental work is covered by that. But that's too broad of a scope for us to really address specifically here. But I would say in general, it is accepted practice to be reimbursed for those expenses or to have those as part of a grant cost. In terms of federal agency reactions, I think some things have been mixed. I mean, we work with different federal agencies across the country and throughout Michigan, all with different levels of experience with 106, different ways of dealing with it. So there are some agencies that are very, very sophisticated about Section 106, and they understand what the needs are and what the requirements are. Other agencies are less familiar and are having more of a struggle. So we are addressing those. There's a learning curve here. We understand that for everybody, and we're trying to work hard with these agencies. We've been in conversations for over a year about this, between when it was just an idea to now where we're actually making some concrete change, and we understand there's going to be a transition period before everybody's on board.
I will just say too, I deal a lot with the consultants, and prior to July 1st, it was kind of anybody and everybody. And a lot of times the folks that were doing the agency, your all's 106, was an engineer or my favorite recently was an underground storage tank specialist or a wetland scientist, and people that have no clue what they're doing and have gotten kind of shoved into this and told, you're going to do this. And these people that I've talked to are super relieved that they don't have to try to stumble through this anymore. So I encourage everyone to think about it that way. You wouldn't want me as an architectural historian to go out and do your wetland assessment. It's the same sort of thing. Or you certainly don't want me going out and removing an underground storage tank as a architectural historian. So it's the same sort of thing. So we just encourage people to think about it that way. But like Martha said, this is a big change for Michigan because we have not done this. But most of the surrounding states around us, we talked to about 25 of the 50 states, and most of the states around us do this already. But we understand this is going to be a big change.
Okay, this one may require someone on the SHPO staff to look back in the regs for something specific. So I will ask this, then we'll jump to another question, and then maybe we can answer it after that. Virginia asked, where does it say that the agency must mitigate adverse effects? And that's relating to a couple slides back where it was talking about adverse effect.
I can do that.
Okay.
So basically in 800.6, the resolution of adverse effects, it basically says agencies shall consult with a SHPO, continue to consult with a SHPO or TIPO to evaluate alternatives or modifications to the undertaking that it could avoid, minimize, or mitigate. So maybe when we said you have to mitigate, you have to resolve, and that's typically through mitigation. You have to resolve adverse effects. That's what the regs say. So I hope that answers the question.
Ideally, though, we'd like to avoid the adverse effects.
Exactly.
That's the first step. We want to avoid. If we can't avoid, then we need to resolve it. We need to mitigate. Mitigate is identifying some means to compensate, essentially, for the impact. Let me just give some people examples of what we've seen. There are no limitations as to what could be for mitigation, except for what the parties are willing to agree to in a situation or in a resolution. It could be something, typically we see documentation, photographs, sometimes exhibits, or a educational product being produced regarding the resource. Sometimes there is some kind of guidance put forward or some kind of improvement to processes that could be done. And also there can be some kind of economic element to it, such as, paying for training or paying for improvements to another resource, saving a different resource, even though another one has been destroyed. So those are all kinds of options for mitigation. There's no limit except to what the parties are willing to agree to.
And like I say, once again, mitigation involves not just the SHPO, but involves other interested parties as well. That's where we look for any kind of efforts that have done to reach out to the public. The first thing we want to hear is, what does the public think about this? And what are their thoughts about mitigation?
Okay, question from Lindsay Ross. How will consultants and locals be notified of the training and education opportunities, referring to these changes, I think? Will state partners also be notified of training and education opportunities going forward?
So I can handle this one. We have a list that we have gathered over the course of the last 6 months or so for that, and that's what we sent this email announcement to. So if you got this from our office, then you're already on our list to be notified for things. If you did not, if this was forwarded to you by another coworker or another agency, go ahead and email that preservation@michigan.gov email. Let me go back to it. The one here on the bottom, and just let us know who you want on the list. Our applications, our current application does not ask for email addresses, so we don't have a lot of email addresses right now. So we had about 75 people, I think, or so that we had on our list that we gathered, and then we tried to just get it out as much as we could. So if you want to make sure that you're on that list and you didn't get the email from us for this particular presentation, be sure to email that email, and Nathan and I will work together to make sure that list gets updated. Consultants, obviously I maintain those consultant lists, and they get emails fairly regularly from me about training opportunities and that kind of thing. So they'll be notified if they're on our list. So and then we'll also,
Okay.
obviously, we'll post them on social media. We also post them on the website. So if you check our website fairly frequently, or if you check our social media, they'll be on there as well. So.
Yep. We have several questions relating to the letter of delegated authority, which we will tackle in a minute. Before that, though, maybe for Stacy or Katie from Elizabeth, can federal agencies request archaeological information from the SHPO office to assist in the identification of historic properties?
If they have a qualified archaeologist, yes.
Okay.
We deal with a number of archaeologists at federal agencies, and they obviously have access to that information. So.
Okay, so relating to the delegation of authority, there are several questions. I will try to sort of consolidate these and see if we can answer all of them. From Steve, first question, for local road agencies, does the delegation of authority need to be agency specific, or can FHWA provide a blanket delegation to MDOT and local agencies?
That's a good question. I'll take a stab at it. I guess at first blush, I would think they can provide a blanket delegation, but that might involve some more conversation with MDOT and Federal Highways to see what they're comfortable with.
Okay, kind of directly following up relating to that, from Jeff, for federal road funds, does FHWA delegate authority to MDOT, who then delegates authority to locals, or are we, the SHPO, what are we as SHPO expecting in terms of the letter of formal delegation of authority?
From my understanding, MDOT keeps an arm's length relationship with the local agency program. So I would think it's the federal highways would delegate that directly to the local agency. You know, our our expectation would be whatever, given whatever circumstance arises, that it would be the correct in the eyes of the law and appropriate regulations. So I think we're going to have to depend upon federal agencies too for a lot of guidance in that area. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that.
Typically, I think there's a process for formal delegation of authority, and that would include notifying the SHPO at the time that they're doing that. There's a number of programs that we've, I know in the state of Michigan, EPA has formally delegated back in the 1980s the authority to carry out water and sewer projects to the state. And there is a letter on record from the 1980s, so that was done a long time ago, but it was done formally. So it wasn't done on a project by project basis in that case. So that in that case would have been a blanket. So that can occur, but it's more than just sending out a letter. I think there's a process involved in that, and part of that should be ensuring that what we're already asking for is that the people responsible for carrying it out be qualified and sufficient to do it.
Okay, question from Missy, same topic line. Is the FHWA and other agencies who delegate required to provide a letter of delegation for each undertaking or review?
I'm going to defer to staff on that. If we are I think we're keeping something on file for each agency and how they delegate. You may want to include a copy of that with each review that you submit for verification. I think that would probably be the best way to handle it, but it wouldn't have to be a separate letter that's produced by the Federal Highway Association or whatever federal agency for each project. That seems very onerous to me.
My expectation was if an agency does not do a delegation for a specific program, so kind of across the board, kind of like what I just talked about for the EPA, then at the very least, if they include their own blanket letter for each applicant to send out, as long as there's something from the agency saying you have the ability to do this on my behalf. I don't think it should be our responsibility necessarily to hold that on hand. So yes, there should be at least a copy of it submitted with every project.
Brian,
Never
correct me if
hurts.
I'm wrong. Oh,
Does that make sense?
No, go ahead.
I just was going to say, correct me if I'm wrong, but we often get applications in for projects that the federal agency isn't even aware of. Like they're
Correct.
correct.
Yes, we get projects where the federal agency hasn't even seen it yet. The applicant is sending it to us in anticipation of maybe going to a federal agency. So in that case, it's not Section 106 consultation because there's no agency. There's no federal agency involved. So there's no, on one hand, it's kind of a double-edged sword because on one hand, we always say engage us early, but at the same time, if you're doing it before you even know who your agency is or whether there actually is a federal undertaking, then that's kind of premature.
Yeah, there's many of the other states that we spoke with will only talk to the federal agencies. They won't talk to consultants. They won't talk to anybody but the federal agencies. So it's just it varies. And I think as a former consultant before I came back to SHPO, federal agencies in Michigan often seemed at least the ones that I dealt with were very hands-off. So we are trying to have them be a little more involved in the process.
Okay, from Jay Thomas, is a letter of delegation required for HUD entitlement communities?
That is a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not sure of the answer for that. I think that probably would be a good idea.
HUD just got a new environmental review coordinator. I'm sure as many of you are aware, and because of the retirement of Carmen Rebron. And I think we've had one or two conversations with him so far. And I don't know, I think I read the other day that they were also seeking another one for the Detroit office because he's based in Ohio. So I think that the HUD question is going to have to get figured out over the course of the next few months because we aren't sure, I think, what it's going to look like because they don't have anybody in charge of things right this second.
HUD is very complex and is sort of a different animal than other agencies we deal with. That's why we did make the decision that we aren't changing anything about the rehab cards that we use, if you're familiar with those. And for single family rehab, we're still going to keep our standard review process in place for now.
Okay, question from Jay Thomas. If a consultant is completing the entire Section 106 review, why can't they complete the tribal consultation as well?
Oh, that's a biggie.
So-
Yeah.
Stacy, I don't know if you want to talk or if you want me to talk or
Yeah.
Stacy, do you want to?
For Section 106, tribal consultation is a government-to-government consultation that cannot be down delegated.
That's by law.
Yep.
Yeah, as a consultant, I often got put in the position of kind of having to push back against the federal agency because they would just tell me, oh, well, you just send it on your letterhead. Well, that's not what it's supposed to look like. So don't put your consultants in that position. It's not a very comfortable position to be in.
It also isn't setting the right tone with the tribes to do that.
Very much so. Yeah.
You really need to take seriously that government to government relationship, and really any correspondence or communication with the tribes, particularly as you're initiating 106 or seeking comment, should be done on a government to government basis, whatever that final or ultimate government authority is, whether it's federal or in some cases state and local, if it's been delegated down, say by HUD to an entitlement community. But take that very, very seriously. The tribes are not going to receive very well any correspondence from a consultant. And after that, eventually, sometimes you do that, but certainly not when you're initiating contact and trying to develop a relationship with the tribes. And the SHPO, of course, we step out of that. We step back from that tribal consultation. That is not something that we do directly either with the tribes. I don't know if anybody else has something to add.
Yeah, we tend to only get involved when we're invited for a specific case. In Michigan, we have to answer Katie's earlier question when my mute was on, we have 12 federally recognized tribes in Michigan. We suspect
Right.
that before too long, those numbers will go up with additional tribes being recognized. 8 of those tribes have tribal historic preservation officers, and the ones that don't have TIPOs have appointed representatives to do these kinds of reviews and consultations. So I think what a lot of consultants don't have experience with is understanding which tribes to consult when, that it's not just the tribes who are physically present in Michigan today, but consultation may include a list of tribes that have either historically been forcibly removed from Michigan or have moved from Michigan and might be in other parts of the country. So there's a skill and a knowledge set in knowing who to consult with when, and that it's very important that be done by folks who understand the roles and responsibilities for that at the federal level.
Responses. There's one more here about delegated authority that I missed from Scott. Is the federal agency required to delegate to the selected qualified professional or professionals? How does that delegation work exactly?
You can't delegate to the professional consultants. They aren't part of a process. You would delegate it to a state or local agency, a state or local unit of government. It stays, the government sphere has to stay within this process. The consultants are not responsible for that. So you can't delegate to a consultant. The delegation it implies who has responsibility for this project.
Yeah.
Okay, I know we have a couple of more road specific questions, which we will get to in a minute. Relating to the application, Katie, this is probably a good one for you from Virginia. Does the current application and or future application specifically ask if there is or will be a quote federal undertaking?
Yes, I'm trying to remember what the language is on the physical application, and I don't, of course, have it pulled up. Give me half a second and I will pull it up and I can read it to you.
Okay, maybe while you're doing that, there were a couple of other questions about, and I know we kind of hit this, but maybe we can reiterate, who do you suggest pays for a qualified consultant when funds are already stretched so thin for this type of work?
I think that that's a huge challenge. You know, like you, our staff has been stretched thin, which is one of the motivations that we have for this. The SHPO can only review so many projects and to do so well. As I mentioned earlier for a different question, please look into whether these are qualified expenses for you. Because in my experience, for any federal assistance and federal funding, consulting expenses are part of the qualified expenses for a federal project. They will have to be built in to that project. And I expect that as efficiencies build, consultants get more experienced with this, that costs will become more reasonable. And everything, it depends on the scale of the project, of course, what things are going to cost.
Also be sure to get multiple quotes. When we bid out projects that we'll do National Register grant projects or survey projects. The price ranges that we get vary widely depending on the consulting firm and their overhead and their capacity. So be sure to get multiple quotes for your project because the prices can vary widely. I know there's a question in there about how much it costs. We can't really tell you that because we don't know the specifics of the location, but we do encourage you to get multiple quotes. So.
Yeah, and this process is new to Michigan, but it's certainly not new to many other states. So we encourage you to speak with your agency about how they approach that challenge with the other states who have made this a practice for quite a long time.
And now might be a good time to mention, especially for any of the agencies out there, to engage, to have your own staff that are qualified to do this. There are federal agencies that have qualified architectural historians, and archaeologists that can vet these projects and maybe take care of this kind of work in-house so that doesn't get passed on to applicants in the first place.
And also, I think that if you're working with a full service firm that is saying they're going to do all your NEPA review and they're going to do your Section 106 and submit it for you, verify that they have the appropriate staff on hand, the qualified staff to do so, because you are, as some of my colleagues have pointed out, you are paying for that service, that full service engineering, NEPA analysis, environmental review firm to handle that for you. And if you're doing that, they need to have those qualified consultants on staff or subcontracted in order to do this properly. And that's what we're looking for now. You're already paying for it.
I can go back and answer Virginia's question real quick. So the new application it specifically asks for whether you are submitting under a programmatic agreement. So that's the first thing it asks for. It also asks for if you're submitting additional information on a previous project number, like our current application does. But then it also asks very specifically for the federal funding program or permit that you're actually submitting under, which is not something that current application does, but the new one will ask for that. So for example, if you're submitting under HUD Part 50 funding or HUD, it just depends on what the program is. So it very specifically asks for what the permit or program that you have your federal funding through. So.
Okay, just one other real quick question from Virginia. Can we identify specific other states that are using this process?
So every other state is a little bit different. Some states, I can probably list off 4 or 5 at this point in time, but it's been a couple months since I looked at the list. Some of the ones off the top of my head that I can think of that for the large majority of their projects, there may be exceptions, or they may have agreements with certain agencies that that allow for something different. But the ones that I can think of off the top of my head are Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, and like I said, a lot of them have additional agreements with other agencies that they will. Like I know that Eric keeps submitting this question about Indiana DOT. Indiana is a little bit of it's hard to compare ourselves to Indiana, because Indiana has had a very robust survey program, and every single county in the entire state has been surveyed for architectural resources. They're now in the process of going back and resurveying. They had a lot of private money donations, I think, that allowed them to do that over the course of the last 20 or 30 years. So it's really hard for us to compare ourselves to Indiana, because we do not have every county surveyed, comprehensively surveyed. We're lucky if I would hazard to guess that there's a few counties where we don't have any survey data for above ground records. So it's very hard to look at Indiana as an example, but they do, when they have identification projects, they do require folks to be federally qualified. I think Eric's question specifically is about right-of-way, and Brian kind of addressed that earlier, but I don't know if we want to, Nathan, do you want to finish reading it, or do you want me to finish reading it?
Okay, so what I will suggest is all the staff who are on this, if you click on the Q&A box at the bottom, you can read these. I'm going to read them
It's a
out
long
loud
one.
so that they get in the presentation, so that if anybody has the exact same question, they'll know what was asked. But go ahead and read them, and then we will answer them. I'm going to do Eric's question first. He says, I have worked in Indiana on INDOT federal aid projects, and the SHPO requirements were only required when working outside of the existing road right-of-way. I fully agree that work outside the existing right-of-way needs SHPO clearance. Please explain why SHPO clearance is required in Michigan within the road right-of-way when the right-of-way has been disturbed many times previously over the past 100 years.
I
Depends
would
on what
say
you're
that
doing. Oh, go ahead.
I would say that exemption is not part of our existing programmatic agreement.
Well, it depends on what you're doing within the right of way. Things that you do within the right of way can impact what's outside the right of way. As Katie mentioned when I was talking about indirect impacts earlier, if you're doing a lot of it, we get this for a lot of infrastructure projects where all the work's going to happen within the right of way, so we're not going to impact anything outside. Well, there could be indirect impacts. If you're in a historic, say a historic district, or even maybe out in a rural area, you've got a historic farmstead that's got a row of mature trees that are going to be removed, even though they're in the right of way, they're going to be removed, that historically have been there as long as the farmstead. They contribute to the setting and the character of the property. That could be an adverse effect. Same thing within the right of way. If you're changing maybe patterns of the road, things like that. So those are kind of you have to consider indirect impacts.
And we also have for archaeological concerns. It can be the case that the entirety of right-of-ways have not been previously impacted to the width, length, depth that your project proposes. So we cannot take for granted that the entirety of a given right-of-way is disturbed. If you have a project that is, we encourage those kinds of categories of projects. You know, we don't want to waste anybody's time, and that's why we spend time talking with our MDOT about exemptions in our to include in our programmatic agreement, so that we really focus on the projects that have the potential to impact resources and get the ones that have low or no potential out of the way.
Yeah, I'll just add that we fully anticipate that there will likely be more programmatic agreements or negotiations of programmatic agreements over the course of the next few years. So if you are a local agency and you want your federal agency to do that, make sure you're having those discussions with your parent agency, because those will, I think that a lot of that will have to happen over the course of the next few years.
Yeah, I don't think we explained what a programmatic agreement is, but we do have programmatic agreements with under Section 106 with entities like MDOT and Federal Highway Administration and City of Detroit, for example, for large-scale groups of undertakings to create a more streamlined alternative Section 106 process. So that's something that's worth exploring. I should add too, I just spoke this morning with Denise Donahue at the County Road Association. I know that question is swirling about exemptions, and we are willing to consider other activities that could be exempted from review. I think it's going to take more consideration than we can give right here, but we're willing to listen and to reconsider some of the things that we have on the list or to add more.
Okay, we've got one more question hanging out in the Q&A, but real quick, there was also one from the chat box. It just says, from Ernest, can the FAA delegate to MDOT for certain airport projects?
I suppose that's possible. I think that FAA they need to work with FAA and look at their regulations and see what their delegating authority is, but that's very possible.
Okay, and I'm going to read this one too, just so it makes it on the recording. It says, can you please give us a timeline example? Suppose I have a project scheduled for 2022. It's a traditional roadway resurfacing project, but it will require a SHPO 106 consultation. What kind of workload will be imposed on these consultants statewide? Is there a concern from the SHPO that these consultants will be overwhelmed or bottlenecked with the new statewide workload? How soon in advance should the local agency engage with the SHPO?
So
I just wanted to say my first thought is a resurfacing project might be on the exemption list to begin with, and then it wouldn't be a timeline issue. But go ahead, Katie.
So as I mentioned earlier, we do anticipate that there will be some need for the consultants in the state to do some capacity building. There are a handful of them that have both architectural historians and historians on their staff as one agency or one department or one company. But there are about 65 and about 70, somewhere in the 60s or 70s on each list, on the architecture historian list and on the archaeology list. So there's a lot of people. And like I mentioned, many of them are working on partnerships so that they kind of already have those partnerships set up. We do think that this will be a little bit of a challenge for them as they kind of get used to this. And but they've all been informed, and they've known for about 8 months now that this is happening. And they are kind of just waiting to see how things go. And then, you know, Michigan has a between Michigan and Indiana, there's two of the biggest preservation, at least for the architectural side, and archaeology too. There's a lot of folks in our states and in the Midwest that are coming out of college with these credentials. So I think the potential is there, but I do think there will be some capacity building that these consultants have to do. So in terms of how early, I think that's a hard question to answer because it's going to vary depending on some of the, you know, a few of the consultants that I know that are in the Southeast Michigan area have been really, really busy the last few weeks. Some of the other ones that live on the west side of the state haven't been quite they haven't seen a huge spike in proposals for Section 106 yet. So it's going to depend a little bit on where you're at. If you're in Southeast Michigan, you may want to try to do it fairly early because there are more consultants in Southeast Michigan than there are in other areas, but they're also fairly busy. I do encourage people to look, especially our folks in the UP. If you have projects in the UP, be sure to don't forget about Wisconsin. Wisconsin has a very large pool of archaeologists and architectural historians. I don't know for sure if they maintain a consultants list or not. They may. Some states do, some states don't. But you can also, for UP projects in particular, feel free to look in other states. Like we said earlier, you don't have to use somebody that's on our list. It just is a courtesy that we provide.
I would also add, in terms of thinking about timelines broadly, as a federal agency, state agency, local agency, you know, the SHPO has 30 days by law to respond to an adequately documented finding of effect. And I use that language very specifically because oftentimes we don't get what I would describe as an adequately documented finding of effect. We need to have, that would be having a consultant who's trained and knowledgeable to submit that information would probably provide something that's more adequately documented. But having said that, I think it's important not to make any choice limiting decisions regarding your projects until you've heard from the SHPO, because there's always the potential that your project could result in adverse effects. And then we are entering a process to resolve those adverse effects, or and possibly eventually getting to a memorandum of agreement to memorialize that modification or that resolution. So for your best interests, I would start as early as possible with the 106 process and anticipate that some things could go sideways with that until you hear from us. So take that into consideration. But we frequently get requests to rush things because there's been a delay in getting a hold of SHPO, or we need to resolve something quickly.
If you need to get your project in, to the best of your ability, tell us about the details of your undertaking. And down the road, if you need a change in scope, you can let us know about that, and we'll roll with that and work with you on that.
The idea, like I said earlier, it's kind of a double-edged sword, because in some cases you're already planning for your project and you don't even have an agency engaged yet. So it's kind of, it's premature to be actual having consultation with the SHPO, formal consultation, but at the same time, you want to be thinking early on about how your project might affect historic resources. So you can always do research. You can always, check on what we have available as far as research, and you can, engage with your consultant. At least start thinking about, at least have that in mind, how the project could impact historic resources.
You have one more question in the chat box. I don't know if you saw that one, Nathan, but Missy
Yes.
wants to know if we could mention where the exemptions list is. And when we're talking about the exemptions list, we're talking about the MDOT local road agency exemption list. So just so that's clear.
It's only MDOT local agency projects that we're talking about. And it's linked to the MDOT's website, but I don't know exactly where. I expect if you go to
Sigrid, just if you go to the
chat box.
Sigrid just posted the link there.
Thank you, Sigrid. Sigrid is the cultural resource professional at MDOT, and she's awesome.
I just want to reiterate one more time, primarily for the recording. If you are wondering where these changes are, where you can find them in writing, and the background on them, and where to find this presentation, you can go to www.michigan.gov/SHPO. That's our homepage. Right at the top, there's a red bar that says changes are coming to Section 106 in Michigan. Just follow the link from that red bar and it will take you to a summary and this presentation and some other supporting documents. Also, if you think of other questions after this presentation for SHPO staff about the changes, please email them to preservation@michigan.gov, and we will get them to the appropriate staff person who will get you a response.
Well,
That's
I want
all
to
the
thank
questions.
I want to thank everybody today and for all your great questions and for your attention. I think I said 125, but I think we had over 100 people today. So that was a great reception, and thanks. And we look forward to hearing more from you. Bye.